In the early decades of the 20th century, naval warfare was still shaped by centuries of tradition. Battleships ruled the seas with massive guns and armor, and aircraft carriers were only beginning to prove their worth. But hidden beneath the surface of this traditional mindset was an invisible revolution, one that would forever alter the balance of power on the world's oceans. That revolution was radar. The word itself, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, represented an entirely new way of thinking about combat at sea. Instead of relying solely on human eyes, searchlights, or sound, radar allowed navies to detect enemies at distances once thought impossible, through fog, through clouds, and most importantly, in complete darkness. For the United States Navy, the journey to naval radar began quietly in the 1930s, in laboratories where a handful of scientists and engineers experimented with high-frequency radio waves. They discovered that pulses of energy could bounce off distant objects and return as echoes. With careful measurement, these echoes revealed the presence, direction, and even the approximate range of a ship or aircraft. The concept was simple in theory, but building equipment that was sensitive, reliable, and compact enough for naval use was a far greater challenge. Early sets were large, fragile, and extremely limited, yet the pressure of an approaching global conflict gave American research a sense of urgency. By 1937, the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington had already produced a prototype radar set capable of detecting aircraft more than 20 miles away. It was a crude device by later standards, but for the first time in history, a ship could see planes long before they were visible to the naked eye. These breakthroughs coincided with rising tensions in Europe and Asia, where fascist regimes were expanding and Japan's empire was moving deeper into China. The U.S. Navy recognized that technology could tip the scales in the coming conflict, so it invested heavily in radar development, bringing together scientists, engineers, and officers in an unprecedented partnership. The first practical naval radar installations appeared on American destroyers and cruisers in the late 1930s. These early sets, such as the CXAM radar, were bulky, often mounted on exposed platforms, and required highly trained operators to interpret the signals. But their promise was undeniable. A destroyer equipped with radar could track aircraft long before spotters saw them, giving its crew precious minutes to prepare anti-aircraft guns. On the open ocean, where minutes could mean the difference between survival and destruction, this was revolutionary. American aviators also began experimenting with airborne radar, though the technology was still in its infancy. Carriers experimented with directing fighters using radar bearings, an early step toward modern air control. For the first time, a carrier task force could function at night with some measure of confidence. The real test came with the outbreak of World War II. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a radar set at Oahu's Opana Station actually detected the incoming wave of Japanese planes. The warning was not acted upon decisively, but the event proved radar's potential. Within months, radar became a critical tool for every fleet unit. American destroyers and carriers equipped with these sets suddenly had a new advantage. They could prepare before the enemy appeared. For Japanese pilots, who had trained for surprise attacks and relied on visual spotting, this invisible eye was something they could not counter. At first, Japanese intelligence underestimated the importance of American radar. They knew the technology existed, but assumed it was primitive and unreliable. Early reports from pilots suggested strange encounters where American ships seemed to anticipate attacks even in complete darkness. Japanese commanders explained these incidents away as chance or superior scouting. Yet as the months rolled on, evidence mounted that something far more significant was happening. In battles near the Solomon Islands, Japanese night raids that once relied on stealth began to meet walls of anti-aircraft fire, guided not by searchlights but by radar detection. American operators, often very young sailors, sat in darkened rooms watching glowing blips on cathode ray screens. To them, those blips represented incoming bombers or torpedo planes. They would relay precise bearings to gunners and fighter directors, allowing defenses to come alive before the enemy even glimpsed their target. The difference was striking. Where once Japanese pilots approached undetected, now they found ships ready, guns elevated, and fighters already climbing into the night sky. For men trained in doctrines of surprise and precision, this was unnerving. They had counted on the cover of night, on cloud banks, and on the limitations of human eyesight. Suddenly, none of that mattered. The technical details of radar were extraordinary for the time. Sets like the SC and later the SG radars provided detection ranges of dozens of miles. Operators could track entire formations, plotting their course on plotting boards in real time. This information fed directly into command decisions, altering fleet tactics overnight. American admirals quickly realized they could use radar not just defensively but offensively, guiding cruisers and destroyers into night actions with unprecedented accuracy. Japanese cruisers, long considered masters of night combat, began suffering unexpected defeats. The early installation process was far from smooth. Radars were delicate, power-hungry, and required skilled maintenance. Many sailors distrusted the new devices at first, preferring the reliability of binoculars and visual spotting. Yet, every successful interception reinforced radar's value. Stories circulated throughout the fleet of entire air attacks broken up before they began, of destroyers avoiding torpedoes launched under the cover of darkness, and of carriers spared from surprise thanks to early warnings. The psychological boost was immense. American crews began to believe they had an invisible shield, and to a large degree, they did. For Japanese pilots, the growing presence of radar at sea was something beyond comprehension. Their training had emphasized daring, discipline, and surprise. They honed tactics that exploited gaps in enemy observation, but now those gaps were closing rapidly. Reports of American ships firing in pitch blackness or launching fighters toward unseen targets seemed impossible. Some pilots speculated about supernatural explanations, others assumed espionage or luck. Only gradually did Japanese command acknowledge that radar was the answer, but by then, America's radar network had expanded across the Pacific. The significance of these early years cannot be overstated. Radar shifted the balance of naval warfare before the Japanese fully realized what they were facing. It began as a scientific experiment, became a prototype on destroyers, and by 1942 had evolved into a fleet-wide advantage. It turned the vast Pacific, often shrouded in darkness and storms, into a battle space where the United States Navy could see without being seen. And this was only the beginning. In the years to come, radar would not just protect ships, but guide entire campaigns, coordinate fleets, and ultimately play a decisive role in breaking Japan's ability to wage war at sea. The silent eyes of the ocean had been opened, and Japanese pilots were about to discover that the night no longer belonged to them. When night fell over the Pacific, it once meant safety for Japanese pilots. Darkness was their ally, concealing the approach of torpedo bombers, hiding dive bomber squadrons in cloud cover, and allowing formations to move undetected across open water. Japanese naval doctrine placed enormous emphasis on night operations. Pilots and sailors trained relentlessly for nighttime maneuvers, confident that superior discipline and night optics gave them a decisive advantage. In the early months of the Pacific War, this confidence proved justified. American task forces, caught in darkness, often failed to respond until bombs were already falling or torpedoes already in the water. Japanese aviators believed the cloak of night would always belong to them. That belief began to shatter the moment American radar sets came into play. Radar transformed the nature of night raids. Instead of relying on human eyes scanning the horizon, American destroyers and carriers could now detect incoming aircraft long before they were visible. Operators sitting in dimly lit radar rooms saw blips emerge on their cathode ray screens miles away. Each blip represented an enemy plane, closing in with lethal intent. Information flowed rapidly to the bridge and combat information centers, where officers plotted courses and alerted anti-aircraft gunners. Instead of being surprised, American crews were prepared, waiting with guns trained and fighters ready to intercept. For Japanese pilots expecting darkness to mask their approach, the sudden eruption of tracers and flak was terrifying. What they thought was an unseen attack turned into a deadly ambush against them. The battles around the Solomon Islands in 1942 and 1943 provided some of the first dramatic demonstrations of this new reality. Japanese squadrons launched night attacks against American shipping near Guadalcanal, confident in their experience with nocturnal combat. Yet, time and again, they found their formations tracked and intercepted before reaching their targets. Pilots described their confusion at how destroyers seemed to react instantly, opening fire in pitch blackness with uncanny accuracy. Others reported American fighters materializing in the dark sky as if guided by an unseen hand. Radar was that hand. In one instance, radar-equipped ships warned carrier fighters of an incoming raid well before it reached visual range. Interceptors climbed into the night and met the Japanese head-on, scattering their formation and breaking the attack before a single bomb could be released. For Japanese pilots, these encounters felt like a betrayal of nature itself. Night had always been their strongest weapon. It shielded their movements, multiplied their chances of survival, and gave them opportunities to strike vulnerable American convoys. Now that shield was being stripped away. American radar rendered darkness irrelevant. Pilots accustomed to silent approaches now faced the eerie reality that they were visible to the enemy, even when unseen by human eyes. The shock was profound, especially for kamikaze pilots later in the war who had expected the cover of night to guarantee surprise. One critical advantage radar offered was reaction time. In air combat, seconds decide life or death. A radar warning 10 or 15 minutes in advance gave American ships time to bring gunners to battle stations, warm up engines, and vector fighters into position. Japanese aviators, by contrast, arrived over their targets only to find the defenses fully active. Instead of catching crews off guard, they faced coordinated fire. The experience was demoralizing. Some Japanese after-action reports described how waves of aircraft failed to score hits because American ships maneuvered evasively the moment their approach began. Pilots realized with horror that their enemy was no longer blind at night. Radar also changed surface engagements. Japanese aircraft frequently coordinated with destroyers and cruisers to attack American task forces under cover of darkness. But as American radar networks expanded, these coordinated attacks faltered. Ships guided by radar could detect approaching squadrons and adjust formation accordingly. Fighter directors on carriers used radar plots to vector Wildcats and later Hellcats directly toward enemy aircraft, even guiding them without visual contact. Pilots in the cockpits of American fighters trusted the radar operators' voices over the radio, steering them through the darkness toward unseen targets. Japanese aviators had no answer to this invisible coordination. What had once been a safe environment turned into a deadly trap. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, highlighted the maturity of this system. Though not all engagements occurred at night, radar's contribution was decisive. Long before Japanese planes reached the American fleet, radar detected them, and interceptors were directed with precision. The same applied during nocturnal raids later in the campaign. Every attempt by Japanese forces to exploit night conditions met with heavy losses, as radar-guided defenses cut them down. Survivors reported the chilling realization that American ships seemed to know exactly when and where they were coming. Fear spread through Japanese squadrons. Night missions that once promised higher chances of survival now carried near certain death. For kamikaze pilots, radar was especially devastating. Their tactic relied on surprise and the shock of sudden, overwhelming sacrifice. But as radar-guided gunners grew adept at tracking them, many kamikaze missions were disrupted before they reached striking range. Formations were broken apart, individual aircraft picked off in the dark sky, and the intended impact of mass suicide attacks diminished. The psychological effect was severe. Pilots preparing for their final mission often entered the cockpit with the knowledge that the enemy could already see them, long before they saw their target. The aura of invincibility around kamikaze strikes began to erode. Radar also undermined Japanese morale indirectly by nullifying months of specialized training. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night flying techniques, navigation by stars, and coordinated torpedo runs designed to overwhelm American ships in darkness. Crews prided themselves on this unique skill set, but radar erased those advantages overnight. The most experienced night aviators found their training useless against technology that could track them regardless of visibility. In interviews after the war, several Japanese veterans admitted that the realization was crushing. It felt as though all their discipline and courage had been rendered obsolete by an invention they could neither see nor counter. The Americans exploited radar relentlessly. Combat information centers aboard carriers became the nerve centers of night defense. Operators tracked raids, fed data to gunners, and coordinated with aircraft controllers. Destroyers formed radar picket lines around fleets, extending the range of detection even further. These picket ships often bore the brunt of kamikaze attacks later in the war, but they bought crucial minutes of warning for the fleet behind them. For Japanese attackers, it meant every approach was anticipated. No matter how carefully they plotted their courses, no matter how silently they flew at low altitude, radar stripped away their secrecy. By 1945, the psychological shift was complete. Japanese pilots no longer trusted the cover of night. Reports indicate that some squadrons hesitated to launch night missions, fearing that radar would expose them immediately. Commanders struggled to adapt tactics, experimenting with low-level approaches, masked raids, or diversionary feints. Yet each attempt faltered in the face of radar's unblinking gaze. Even cloud cover, once a reliable ally, offered little refuge. Radar pierced through weather conditions that human eyes could not. The very environment of the Pacific, vast and unpredictable, now favored the Americans. The impact on Japanese strategy was devastating. Their doctrine had assumed that superior skill could compensate for inferior industrial output. Night combat was central to this philosophy. But when radar stripped away the effectiveness of those night tactics, the imbalance between American production and Japanese attrition became catastrophic. Every failed raid cost aircraft and pilots Japan could not replace. Every intercepted attack further drained their dwindling resources. For American sailors, radar became a symbol of technological superiority. Crews spoke of their confidence during night watches, knowing the radar operators were their unseen guardians. Survivors of raids often credited radar with saving their lives. The knowledge that the enemy could be detected before striking gave them resilience during long months at sea. Radar did not eliminate casualties. Japanese attacks still inflicted damage and loss, but it drastically reduced the scale of devastation compared to what might have been without it. Looking back, it is clear that radar did more than just level the playing field. It tilted it decisively. The Japanese entered the war believing darkness gave them dominance. Radar shattered that illusion and forced them to confront a battlefield where their traditional strengths meant little. For pilots who once trusted the night sky as a shield, encountering radar was like flying against an invisible wall. Every mission carried not only the danger of enemy fire, but the chilling certainty that they were already seen, already tracked, and already doomed before they reached their target. This transformation marked a turning point in the Pacific War. It was not as dramatic as a single battle or as visible as a massive carrier engagement, but it quietly undermined the foundation of Japanese air power. Radar robbed them of surprise, stripped away their confidence, and replaced it with fear. In the words of one American officer after the war, radar did not just let the U.S. Navy see through the night, it allowed them to own it. And for Japanese pilots who once soared under the cover of darkness, that ownership was a nightmare they could never escape. By late 1944, Japan's air forces were in a desperate situation. Losses at the Marianas and the Philippine Sea had decimated the once proud carrier air groups. Experienced pilots were gone, aircraft production was struggling to keep pace, and fuel shortages limited training for new recruits. Facing overwhelming American naval strength, Japanese commanders turned to a tactic both desperate and terrifying: the kamikaze. These suicide missions promised to turn the bodies of young pilots into guided weapons, crashing directly into enemy ships. The concept relied on shock and surprise. If enough pilots struck with precision, they might slow the American advance and force a negotiated peace. For a brief time, the tactic seemed devastating. Ships were damaged, lives were lost, and fear spread through the American fleet. But then radar altered the equation. Radar robbed kamikaze pilots of their most vital advantage, the element of surprise. A suicide attack depended on approaching undetected, breaking through defensive screens, and striking before gunners had time to react. Early missions succeeded largely because American sailors were unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the attacks. But as radar coverage expanded, each attempt became harder. Picket destroyers stationed miles ahead of the fleet could spot incoming formations long before they reached striking distance. Their radar warnings were relayed instantly to the main task force, giving anti-aircraft crews the crucial minutes they needed. Instead of surprise, kamikaze squadrons found themselves flying directly into walls of fire. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 marked the first large-scale use of kamikaze tactics. Japanese pilots struck with determination, sinking several American ships and damaging others. But already, radar was making a difference. American commanders quickly adapted, assigning radar-equipped ships to form detection screens around their carriers. These vessels, often destroyers and smaller escorts, became the eyes of the fleet. Their operators could see Japanese aircraft approaching from dozens of miles away. Warnings were broadcast across the task force, and combat air patrols were vectored to intercept. Kamikaze pilots, expecting to dive unchallenged onto their targets, instead found fighters climbing to meet them. For every pilot who broke through, several were cut down before they ever saw the American carriers. As the campaign in the Philippines continued, the pattern repeated. Kamikaze missions that had been planned with the expectation of devastating losses for the enemy often ended with entire formations destroyed. The shock value diminished. Sailors no longer faced sudden explosions from out of nowhere. Instead, they endured prolonged engagements where alarms sounded long before the attackers arrived. The fear of surprise was replaced by a grim readiness. American crews trusted that radar would give them warning, and that warning was often enough to blunt the effectiveness of suicide tactics. In March and April 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, kamikaze attacks reached their peak. Thousands of sorties were launched in waves against the American fleet. This was Japan's last gamble, an attempt to bleed the invasion force so badly that the United States might hesitate to land on the home islands. The attacks inflicted terrible losses. Dozens of ships were sunk or damaged. But even at their height, radar ensured that the damage was not worse. Radar picket stations ringed Okinawa, each manned by destroyers and radar-equipped escorts. These picket ships bore enormous risk, as they were the first line of detection and often the first targets of kamikazes. Many were hit and destroyed, yet their sacrifice protected the larger fleet. By providing early warning, they allowed carriers and battleships to ready their defenses. Each intercepted wave of kamikazes was a testament to the effectiveness of radar-guided vigilance. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots, the experience was harrowing. Accounts from survivors reveal how missions often began with confidence but ended in chaos. Pilots flying low over the sea or through clouds believed they were invisible, only to find American fighters diving on them from unseen directions. Others pushed through to the fleet, only to be met with a storm of anti-aircraft fire already directed at their approach path. For men expecting to deliver sudden, decisive blows, the realization that their enemy was prepared was shattering. It stripped the kamikaze tactic of its psychological edge. Instead of instilling terror, the attacks increasingly represented a tragic waste of life. Radar also enabled American ships to coordinate their defenses more effectively. Without radar, gunners relied on visual spotting, opening fire only once aircraft were visible. With radar, ships could track formations in advance, aligning their guns and setting fire control directors before the enemy appeared. This meant that kamikazes often entered fully prepared defensive zones. The devastation was mutual. Some pilots managed to break through, but many were cut apart by concentrated barrages long before reaching their targets. The attrition rate skyrocketed, and Japan could not sustain such losses. The human factor on both sides was profound. For Japanese pilots, the growing futility of kamikaze missions eroded morale. They were told that sacrifice would guarantee success, yet radar denied them that promise. Death came before glory. For American sailors, radar brought reassurance. They knew attacks would come, but they also knew they would not be blind. This knowledge steadied nerves and reduced panic. Instead of chaos at the first sight of diving aircraft, crews moved into disciplined action, already guided by the invisible eye of radar. One striking example occurred during the attack on USS Bunker Hill in May 1945. Despite radar coverage, 2 kamikazes managed to penetrate defenses and strike the carrier, causing massive casualties. The incident demonstrated that radar was not an impenetrable shield. Yet, even in this tragedy, radar had lessened the scale. Dozens of other kamikazes were intercepted before reaching the fleet. Without radar warning, the damage might have been multiplied many times over. The Japanese command recognized the problem but had no solution. Their radar technology lagged far behind, and fuel shortages crippled training in evasive maneuvers. Tactics such as approaching at wave-top altitude or scattering formations provided temporary success, but American radar adapted quickly. Lower frequency sets detected sea-skimming aircraft, and coordinated radar networks closed gaps in coverage. By mid-1945, almost no kamikaze mission could truly claim the element of surprise. The tragic irony is that kamikaze pilots entered the war's final months, believing their sacrifice would alter history, while radar ensured that most of those sacrifices changed nothing. Each young man who launched into the sky carried the weight of national desperation, but most met their end miles from their targets, detected, tracked, and destroyed before making impact. The desperation of the tactic collided with the cold efficiency of technology, and technology prevailed. For historians, radar's role in defeating the kamikaze threat is clear. It did not eliminate the danger American ships still burned, and thousands of sailors lost their lives, but it prevented catastrophe on a scale Japan had hoped to achieve. Without radar, suicide missions might have inflicted crippling damage on the invasion fleet, potentially altering the timetable for Okinawa and beyond. With radar, those missions became a grim but contained threat, one the U.S. Navy could endure. In the end, radar was not just a tool of detection, it was a weapon in itself, undermining the very foundation of kamikaze doctrine. Surprise, once Japan's last advantage was gone. What remained was only sacrifice without effect. For the men in the cockpits, this realization came too late, often in their final moments as tracer fire cut through the night sky. For the men on American decks, radar was the silent guardian, ensuring that while the attacks were brutal, they were never decisive. It is a sobering reminder of how technology can reshape even the most desperate human strategies, and how the invisible power of radar helped end the era of kamikaze terror at sea. The story of radar's impact on the Pacific War is not only about machines, tactics, and strategy. It is also deeply human. At the heart of every raid and every countermeasure were young men in the cockpits of Japanese aircraft, many of them barely trained, carrying with them the hopes of a desperate empire. They were told that their sacrifice would turn the tide of war, that courage and devotion could overcome American industry. But what they encountered in reality was an invisible adversary. Radar that stripped away their confidence, destroyed their faith in surprise, and filled their final missions with fear and despair. Understanding the human factor in this struggle reveals the true psychological devastation caused by technology. In the early years of the conflict, Japanese aviators believed firmly in their superiority. They were trained in doctrines that emphasized discipline, precision, and above all, surprise. Surprise was their greatest weapon, the guarantee that even against larger forces, they could strike suddenly and decisively. The night sky, the cover of clouds, the approach from the sun, all of these elements gave them confidence. But as radar spread across the American fleet, that confidence began to erode. Pilots who had once flown boldly into battle found themselves met with anti-aircraft fire long before they thought they were detected. Reports filtered back from survivors describing how American ships opened fire in total darkness, how fighters intercepted them in clouds, how nothing seemed hidden anymore. These stories spread quickly through squadrons, and with them came a creeping sense of dread. The effect was especially stark among kamikaze pilots. These young men were told that their deaths would be glorious, that they would strike with the suddenness of lightning, shocking the Americans and dealing crushing blows. They believed they would appear from nowhere, giving the enemy no time to react. Yet the reality was different. Time after time, they discovered that radar robbed them of that suddenness. Their squadrons were intercepted on the way to the target, broken apart before they could dive. Many never even glimpsed an American ship before being cut down. For those who survived to return, the experience was disillusioning. The promise of a swift, effective sacrifice was replaced with the horror of futility. Fear became an unspoken companion in the cockpits. Pilots launching into the night knew that the enemy could see them even when they could not see the enemy. The invisible nature of radar made it feel almost supernatural. They were not fighting men alone. They were fighting an unseen eye that watched them relentlessly. This fear was compounded by the awareness that they were likely on a one-way mission. Death was certain, but the question of whether that death would matter gnawed at them. It is one thing to die in battle, striking a decisive blow. It is another to die unseen and unremembered, shot down miles from the target, without even the satisfaction of impact. The shock of facing radar was not only tactical, but also cultural. In Japanese military tradition, courage and determination were considered supreme. A warrior spirit could overcome material odds. Radar defied this belief. No matter how determined a pilot was, no matter how skillful or brave, he could not will himself to be unseen. Technology stripped away the power of spirit. For many, this realization was profoundly unsettling. It shook the very foundation of their training, which had emphasized willpower and sacrifice above technical innovation. The contrast with the American approach, where science and engineering were celebrated as force multipliers, was stark. Pilots could sense that they were fighting not only an enemy navy, but an entire system that valued technology over tradition, and that system was winning. The desperation of Japanese command filtered down into the attitudes of pilots as well. By 1945, fuel was scarce, aircraft quality was declining, and training was abbreviated to the bare minimum. Young men were pushed into cockpits with only a few dozen hours of flight time, tasked with missions that veterans had struggled to complete. These inexperienced aviators faced an enemy who could see them long before they saw their target. Many must have known, even before takeoff, that their mission was doomed. Some wrote final letters expressing resignation. Others clung to the hope that they might at least hit something. But the growing presence of radar meant that hope was fading. Their commanders still spoke of honorable sacrifice, but among the pilots themselves, fear and futility grew louder. One of the cruelest aspects of radar's psychological effect was the uncertainty it created. A pilot flying low over the ocean at night could not know whether he had been detected. Every mile flown carried the gnawing suspicion that American operators were already tracking him, already guiding interceptors to his position. Some squadrons tried evasive maneuvers, zigzagging routes, or low-altitude approaches to escape detection. Yet, again and again, they found American ships and fighters waiting. The realization that there was no safe path deepened the sense of helplessness. To be hunted in the dark by an unseen enemy was a nightmare beyond training, a reality for which no samurai code could prepare them. Even experienced pilots who survived multiple missions found themselves shaken. Accounts after the war describe men who once prided themselves on calm, under pressure, breaking into visible fear before night raids. Some spoke openly about their dread of radar, describing it as an invisible net cast across the ocean. The strain of constant failure, of watching comrades die without achieving success, eroded morale. This psychological collapse was as damaging as the physical losses. An air force that no longer believed in its mission could not fight effectively, no matter how many planes it launched. For American crews, this psychological collapse among the enemy was visible. Radar not only guided their defenses, but also created confidence. Sailors who had once feared sudden night raids now trusted that they would receive warning. That trust steadied them in the face of kamikaze waves. They watched as attackers were broken apart miles from the fleet, saw the futility of repeated Japanese efforts, and drew strength from it. Where Japanese morale faltered, American morale solidified. This contrast only deepened the psychological gulf between the two sides. The human factor also extended to Japanese commanders, who wrestled with the realization that they were sending men to certain death with little chance of success. Some commanders admitted privately that radar had nullified the value of kamikaze tactics, yet the desperation of Japan's position left them no alternatives. They continued to order missions, even as losses mounted and results dwindled. This tension filtered down to the pilots, who could sense the hopelessness behind their assignments. Their courage remained, but courage without results only fueled despair. The shock of radar was not instantaneous, it grew over time. In the early encounters, pilots could dismiss their failures as bad luck. But as more and more missions were intercepted, the pattern became undeniable. The Americans could see them coming, always. That cumulative realization spread across the Japanese Air Forces like a shadow, undermining confidence squadron by squadron. By the final months of the war, it was widely understood among pilots that their missions were acts of sacrifice rather than acts of war. The element of battle, of striking a blow, was gone. What remained was only dying in the attempt. For the men themselves, many barely out of adolescence, this truth was devastating. Diaries and letters recovered after the war show a mixture of pride, fear, and resignation. Some clung to the idea of honor, convincing themselves that any sacrifice for the emperor was meaningful. Others expressed quiet doubts, wondering if their deaths would matter at all. The presence of radar, though often not fully understood in technical terms, was frequently mentioned. Pilots knew there was some machine on American ships that could see them in the dark, and they hated it. They felt stripped of their one advantage, forced into a hopeless contest where bravery was irrelevant. This is the true measure of radar's impact. It was not only about ships saved or planes destroyed, it was about the way it reached into the minds of the enemy, sapping their confidence, turning courage into fear and desperation into futility. Japanese pilots entered the war believing their spirit could carry them to victory. They ended it flying against an unseen force that reduced their sacrifice to nothing. The terror of facing radar was not only the fear of death, but the fear of dying uselessly. And in war, that is perhaps the most crushing fear of all. The Pacific War was decided not in a single clash, but in a series of turning points where technology, tactics, and human will converged to shape the course of history. Among these, radar played a quiet but decisive role. It did not fire guns or drop bombs, yet it gave the United States Navy the ability to anticipate, to prepare, and to strike with precision. Nowhere is this more evident than in three pivotal campaigns: Midway in 1942, Guadalcanal from 1942 to 1943, and the Marianas in 1944. Each of these battles marked a shift in momentum, and in each case, radar tilted the balance in favor of the Americans. At Midway, the story of radar begins in the tense days of June 1942. 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward the island, their decks crowded with aircraft. Their plan was to surprise and destroy the American fleet, just as they had at Pearl Harbor. But this time, the Americans were waiting. Signals intelligence had already revealed Japan's intentions, and radar provided the critical early warning that allowed Midway's defenders to respond. On June 4th, radar stations on the island detected incoming Japanese bombers long before they came into view. Operators tracked the raid, giving Marine fighters precious minutes to scramble. Without radar, those planes might have been caught on the ground, destroyed before they could take off. Instead, they were airborne and able to challenge the attackers, reducing the effectiveness of the Japanese strike. Though losses were heavy, the defenders did enough to preserve Midway's airfields. That survival was crucial because it allowed American aircraft to launch the counterattacks that ultimately sank 4 Japanese carriers. Radar did not win Midway by itself, but it was one of the unseen factors that denied Japan total surprise and kept the American defense alive long enough for victory to take shape. Guadalcanal presented an even starker demonstration of radar's power. The campaign stretched over months, marked by brutal land battles and a relentless contest for control of the seas around the island. Japanese forces excelled in night operations, launching raids under cover of darkness that often caught American ships unprepared. Early in the campaign, the U.S. Navy suffered heavy losses in night battles, including the disastrous defeat at Savo Island, where Japanese cruisers struck suddenly and inflicted devastating damage. Yet, as the campaign wore on, radar began to change the equation. By late 1942, American ships were increasingly equipped with SG surface search radar, a more advanced system that allowed precise detection and tracking of enemy vessels at night. For the first time, American commanders could see through the darkness. The impact was immediate. In November 1942, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, radar-directed gunfire gave U.S. ships a critical edge. At one point, radar operators detected Japanese ships approaching before visual contact was made, allowing American forces to maneuver into position. In subsequent engagements, radar-directed fire control systems allowed gunners to track targets they could not see with their eyes. Japanese commanders, accustomed to dominating the night, were stunned to find their own ships under accurate fire in total darkness. This reversal not only preserved American control of Guadalcanal, but also eroded the aura of Japanese superiority in night fighting. Radar gave the Americans confidence to engage at night, turning a former weakness into a strength. The psychological shift was just as important as the tactical one. Sailors who had once dreaded night battles now trusted in the glowing screens of their radar sets. They no longer felt blind after sunset. Instead, they knew they could track enemy movements, vector destroyers into torpedo attacks, and direct cruisers to open fire with precision. Japanese crews, on the other hand, were unnerved. The darkness that had once been their ally now concealed an enemy that could see them while remaining unseen themselves. The fear of the unseen radar eye haunted them just as it had Japanese pilots in the skies. By the end of the campaign, it was clear that radar had neutralized one of Japan's most reliable advantages. 2 years later, in the summer of 1944, the stage shifted to the Marianas. This campaign was larger in scale than Midway or Guadalcanal. It was here that the U.S. Navy launched its assault to capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands that would place American bombers within range of Japan itself. The Japanese could not allow this to happen and committed their remaining carrier forces to battle. The result was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a clash that would later be remembered for the annihilation of Japanese air power. Radar was at the center of it. By 1944, American radar technology had advanced dramatically. Ships bristled with multiple radar sets, air search, surface search, and fire control. Radar picket destroyers extended the range of detection, and combat information centers aboard carriers integrated the data into coordinated defensive plans. When Japanese carriers launched waves of aircraft to strike the American fleet, radar saw them coming from more than 100 miles away. The early warnings allowed fighters to climb and intercept long before the attackers reached their targets. The result was devastating for the Japanese. Wave after wave of aircraft was cut down in what American pilots grimly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 300 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day, at the cost of only a fraction of American losses. For Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare. They launched believing they might surprise the enemy, only to find fighters already waiting. Many never saw the American fleet at all. They were intercepted miles short of their targets. Those who broke through found ships fully prepared, anti-aircraft batteries blazing with radar-directed accuracy. The combination of early detection, coordinated interception, and disciplined defense created a slaughter. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered. The battle ended with the loss of 3 Japanese carriers and the destruction of most of their trained airmen. From that point forward, Japan could no longer conduct effective carrier operations. The skies of the Pacific belonged to the Americans, and radar had played a central role in securing that dominance. The Marianas campaign also demonstrated the maturity of radar-directed coordination. Fighter directors aboard carriers relied entirely on radar plots to guide their pilots. In many cases, American fighters were vectored onto enemy formations they never could have found visually. Pilots trusted the voices in their radios, followed the bearings given, and time after time found themselves in perfect position to ambush the enemy. This coordination was revolutionary. It was not just a matter of early warning, but of real-time control of the air battle. Japanese aviators, flying without such support, entered each engagement at a crippling disadvantage. The turning points of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Marianas reveal a consistent pattern. Radar denied Japan the element of surprise, transformed the balance of night combat, and enabled the Americans to maximize their numerical and industrial advantages. At Midway, it preserved the defenders long enough for victory. At Guadalcanal, it turned night from a Japanese weapon into an American one. At the Marianas, it annihilated Japanese air power and secured the path to Japan's home islands. Each battle marked a shift not only in territory but in psychology. The Japanese began the war confident in their skill and tradition. By the time of the Marianas, they faced the grim reality that no amount of courage could overcome the invisible eyes of radar. It is easy to overlook radar in these turning points because it worked silently, without the drama of exploding bombs or blazing guns. Yet, its influence was everywhere. It was in the early warning that got planes off the ground at Midway. It was in the precision of gunfire at Guadalcanal. It was in the voices guiding fighters in the skies above the Marianas. Technology did not replace courage, but it amplified it, giving American sailors and pilots the tools to fight with confidence. For their Japanese counterparts, it eroded morale, sowed fear, and turned the darkness of the Pacific into a place where death could come unseen. Radar's role in these battles was not the story of a single invention, but of adaptation. The Americans recognized its value, trained their crews to use it, and integrated it into every level of operations. The Japanese, by contrast, underestimated its importance and failed to develop effective countermeasures. By the time they understood its significance, the balance of power had already shifted irreversibly. The turning points of the Pacific War were decided not only by bravery and blood, but by the quiet hum of radar sets scanning the night, ensuring that the United States Navy was never blind again. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was on the defensive, retreating step by step across the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, strengthened by new carriers, battleships, and thousands of aircraft, pressed forward relentlessly. Yet even with superior numbers and firepower, the Americans faced an enemy still determined to resist. It was in the final stages of the war, during the battles of Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, that radar reached its full maturity as a weapon of war. It was no longer an experimental advantage or a tactical supplement. It was the backbone of American naval defense, an invisible shield that allowed the fleet to withstand Japan's last desperate assaults. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval engagement in history. Japan threw nearly every remaining ship into the fight, hoping to cripple the invasion of the Philippines. Their plan was complex: lure American carriers away with a decoy force, strike the transports with battleships and cruisers, and unleash waves of kamikaze aircraft to overwhelm the fleet. It was ambitious, but radar robbed the Japanese of secrecy from the start. Radar-equipped picket ships and aircraft provided early warnings of Japanese movements. American commanders could see through the deception and adjust their forces accordingly. When kamikaze pilots made their first massed attacks at Leyte, radar detected them long before they reached their targets. Combat air patrols were vectored to intercept, and anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. For the Japanese pilots, this was a nightmare. They dove toward the American ships believing they held the initiative, but they were met with organized resistance every time. Many were shot down before they could even begin their dives. Others were scattered by interceptors guided with radar precision. The kamikaze tactic, terrifying in concept, was blunted by technology that denied the element of surprise. Yes, some broke through, and American sailors paid a heavy price in lives and ships. But radar ensured that the scale of destruction was far less than what the Japanese had envisioned. Without it, Leyte Gulf could have ended in disaster for the American fleet. With it, the U.S. Navy endured and maintained its grip on the Philippines. The battle also highlighted the integration of radar into American fleet operations. Combat information centers were no longer experimental. They were essential. Radar plots allowed admirals to track not only aircraft, but entire surface fleets in real time. In the chaotic engagements around Samar, when a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers faced a much larger Japanese force, radar kept commanders aware of approaching threats. Though the battle was decided by the courage of those taffy groups, radar gave them the situational awareness that allowed them to maneuver, evade, and coordinate under impossible pressure. It was technology and human valor working together, turning what could have been a massacre into one of the Navy's most celebrated victories. If Leyte proved radar's strategic value, Okinawa proved its tactical indispensability. The battle for the island in the spring of 1945 was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. For nearly 3 months, Japanese forces launched relentless kamikaze attacks against the American fleet supporting the invasion. More than 1,500 aircraft were thrown into suicide missions, striking day and night, wave after wave. It was the most intense test the U.S. Navy would ever face. At the heart of the defense were the radar picket ships. Destroyers and smaller escorts were stationed miles ahead of the main fleet, forming a perimeter of detection. Their role was brutally dangerous: to spot incoming raids with radar and give warning to the carriers and battleships behind them. These picket ships became the first targets for kamikazes, absorbing ferocious punishment. Many were sunk, their crews sacrificing themselves so that the fleet could live. Yet their mission was vital. Each minute of warning they provided gave American defenses time to respond. Without those warnings, the kamikazes would have struck unopposed, and the losses to the fleet would have been catastrophic. Radar also directed the layered defense that made survival possible. Once picket ships detected incoming formations, the information was relayed to fighter directors aboard carriers. Pilots were scrambled and guided by radar onto collision courses with the attackers. Even when Japanese planes tried to approach at wave-top altitude or under cloud cover, radar picked them up. American fighters broke up formation after formation, reducing the weight of each attack before it reached the fleet. Those that survived then faced ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns, their fire guided by radar-controlled directors. The sky above Okinawa became a deadly gauntlet for Japanese pilots, with few making it through to their targets. Still, the kamikazes inflicted terrible damage. Radar could not stop every attacker. Ships like USS Laffey, known as the ship that would not die, were struck repeatedly, but survived thanks in part to the early warnings radar provided. Others were less fortunate. Radar lessened the destruction, but it could not eliminate it. For American sailors, it meant living under constant assault day after day, with the knowledge that technology gave them a fighting chance. For Japanese pilots, it meant flying into near-certain death, with the crushing awareness that the enemy was ready for them long before they appeared. The psychological effect at Okinawa was immense. American crews, exhausted and under fire, still trusted the radar operators who gave them precious minutes to prepare. They spoke of how the radar blips became symbols of life and death, each one a warning that allowed them to fight back. For Japanese aviators, the same blips meant futility. Survivors described the despair of seeing their comrades shot down miles from their targets, of realizing that no matter how they approached, the Americans were already waiting. By the end of the campaign, the kamikaze strategy was revealed for what it truly was, a tragic sacrifice that could not change the outcome. Radar had stripped it of its power. The endgame of radar dominance was not just about Okinawa. It symbolized the larger truth of the Pacific War, that technology and adaptation had shifted the balance irreversibly. Japan had entered the war with faith in the spirit of its warriors and the traditions of surprise and skill. The United States had entered with an unshakable belief in science, industry, and innovation. Radar embodied that belief. From the laboratories of the 1930s to the battles of 1945, it evolved into a weapon that could see through darkness, anticipate attacks, and give sailors the confidence to stand firm under the most desperate conditions. When the war finally ended in August 1945, it was the atomic bomb that dominated headlines. But radar, quieter and less dramatic, had been one of the decisive technologies that made victory possible. It had saved countless ships, preserved the momentum of offensives, and denied Japan the ability to strike effectively in the final battles. For Japanese pilots, radar was a silent enemy, one they could never outfly, outfight, or outdie. For American sailors, it was the constant guardian, the unblinking eye that saw danger before it arrived. The story of radar at Leyte Gulf in Okinawa is the story of technology reshaping war. It is the story of young men on both sides grappling with fear, courage, and despair in the face of forces larger than themselves. And it is the story of how an invisible beam of energy could alter the fate of nations. If you found this journey through the hidden role of radar in the Pacific War fascinating, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into history's turning points. And tell me, what do you think? Could Japan have found any way to counter radar, or was it truly the technology that sealed their fate? Let me know in the comments below.